This is no ordinary departmental seminar for a number of reasons. But one reason is that Willem Paul de Roever's visit to Swansea is connected with not just giving a seminar, but with the fact that he's kindly donated a large number of documents and theses and personal papers to the university's History of Computing collection. Now you remember we announced the existence of this collection in a rather low-key way last year, and we're building it up slowly and surely in various directions. One direction, which was associated with the announcement last year, was to chart the development of computing in all its varied forms in the region, a kind of local history of the way computing has emerged in let's say, South Wales. And that was progressing gently and slowly. And the other aspect of the collection is to choose one or two specialist areas of academic interest, of international interest, of course, and to examine those particular areas in more detail, and in particular to collect and preserve and rescue information about the early years of our subject. Now, one of the areas that would be very natural for us to look at is the relationship between the theory of programming and programming languages and the various different fields that have contributed to that and the way in which it's developed and gained a life of its own in the last 50 years. And it is exactly that area which we call the theory of programming and programming languages and specification languages and lots of other things that Willem Paul has made this generous donation, because he has a wonderful library of papers and documents that he's collected in the course of his professional life. And these are lovingly stored and locked away, as all good archivists have. One of the things that I've learned very early in dealing with our friends in the library who are actively involved in this project is that whatever you do, you must lock things away and look after them very carefully. So, anyway, I do have the keys of all these things, so there you are. And I shall be pleased, of course, to talk you through some of the things, some of the treasures that you'll find there, because a lot of it is to do with program verification. So we now come to our distinguished guest, Willem Paul de Roever. So I don't want to do very much of an introduction in terms of his biography, because as you'll see, one of the things that's the feature of our lecture today is a reflection on his professional experience and his life. So I will just say that, first of all, Willem Paul was brought up in perhaps one of the more interesting places to be brought up if you work in this field, and that is in and around Amsterdam. He's an Amsterdammer and was part of that magical place called the Mathematical Centre in the Boerhavenstraat near the Amstel Brewery.
In a pre-war housed in a pre-war elementary school building.
Exactly. And in fact, Willem Paul had left the Mathematical Centre a few years before I arrived there, but I still have very many happy memories of the Boerhavenstraat. Before it all got very modern and they moved out to the Watergraafsmeer and it became the CWI. Anyway, so Willem Paul worked together with Jaco de Bakker, who in many ways is one of the architects of logic and semantics in the Netherlands, because he specialized in that sort of field under the influence of a man called Van Wijngaarden, who was director of the Mathematical Centre and of course is closely associated with Dijkstra and many others. The Mathematical Centre itself was a research institute in Amsterdam, whose first director, if I remember correctly, was Van der Weerden, I think, the algebraist. Some of you will know his contribution. Beg your pardon. So there, of course, machines were built, operating systems were created, and Dijkstra began his own personal journey from theoretical physics into programming, influenced by Van Wijngaarden. So that's the origins. But subsequently, the subject has expanded enormously. Many, many technical developments, many concepts have emerged from these technologies which have found a life of their own. And in fact, there are many of us who know these things only through meeting them as abstract concepts and working on them. And who the fuzziness of large parts of concurrency in its roots in operating system design and things like that is no hurdle to our own progress. Anyway, Willem Paul has always been interested in the pragmatic dimensions to this theoretical work, and has always had a keen eye on whether something is of use or is not of use, despite, of course, working at a very high theoretical level on questions of semantics, and in particular, the verification of programs. And in particular, quite early on, he was a champion in Holland for pointing out the absolutely essential importance of working on concurrency. And I think it's fair to say that the effect of that championing, I remember going to seminars of yours on concurrency in the first few weeks of my time in Amsterdam, that percolated through and brought in several other people and gradually even shifted the agenda of the core employees of the CWI, of whom, of course, Jaco is our favorite example. So, generally speaking, Willem Paul has looked at concurrency from early times and has done a huge amount of work in that and in related areas. So, one other thing I should mention is that, of course, throughout this professional life, Willem Paul had a keen eye for concepts and also for sorting out, at least to his personal satisfaction, where these concepts come from and which ones, however popular, have real meaning. So we can easily have a fiery discussion on the importance of non-determinism, for example, which Willem Paul is slightly cool about, as opposed to certain other notions in and around the semantics of concurrency. Anyway, I want to draw your attention to further credentials, if those were not enough, and that is in two recent books of Willem Paul. Here we are, two nice fat books published by Cambridge University Press. As one works one's way through the 770 odd pages of concurrency verification and introduction, in the middle of it, this is the real business. After, of course, instructing your students to read through the first 300 or so pages, we get to page 319, and we find in this wonderful book a picture gallery. And of course, what we find in here are many, many interesting pages talking about various individuals who have shaped the whole question of working on this subject. Photographs and little bits of text. For example, one of the things that Willem Paul reminded me of yesterday was Punelli's account of how he came across the value of temporal logic for the specification of concurrency systems, which you can find on page 340. Things to do. So there are many treasures in this book, and of course this wonderful middle bit, which is very relevant to our reflections today. Similarly, before that, Willem Paul had tried his hand on, in this volume, on data refinement. Again, a section of historical photographs with observations relevant to the text of the book. So, I think with that said, I'd like to welcome you formally to our department. I'd like to thank you formally for giving your time, and most importantly, for this wonderful gift of these papers. And we all look forward to hearing your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words, John, for inviting me here. I'm now pensioned, so an ordinary citizen, so I'm always glad to be invited over to lecture. When I arrived here at the station, I saw in front of me the Grand Hotel, it's called, yeah, and at the left of me the sea, so where I'm living in Kiel, selected by my wife, by the way, because she likes living along the sea. This is exactly the same in Kiel as here. You arrive at the station, you hear the gulls, you smell the sea, and the air is fresh. Yeah, I immediately felt at home. I announced a different lecture than the one I give today, and that's because I thought, since this will be the first lecture in a series, I suppose there will be more people donating their archives and being invited, that I should focus not so much on my perspective on a professional life and program verification as well on this archive. Now, it is a bit difficult to structure such a lecture because necessarily my archive reflects my professional interests and the various subjects I focused on. So I hope the first 4 slides are not too dry for you, because I have to tell what I've approximately focused on, and then using these subjects as focus, I'm going to highlight salient parts of my archive in which secret papers are hidden of very important results which the authors didn't want to publish for fear or causing a scandal or for fear of taking the attention away from what they thought was most important, but later on turned out to be not most important. This is, after all, what an archive is for, to have some bits. I worked on 4 topics. My field is semantic specification and proof theory. I didn't know that my slides wouldn't fit on the projector, because they do fit on the projector I used for my course at home. I worked on the relational theory of program verification. David, tell please if I'm making a mistake so that we can correct early. The relational theory of program verification, semantics also, and data refinement. Concurrency, which I consider to be important. Concurrency is the most important topic, and concurrency nowadays, it's also the most important in the modeling of semantics and of specifying, because as we are sitting here, this is approximately, I think, 25 people, 30 people, so we have 25, 30 concurrent actors immediately communicating, and actually that should be the first course and the first topic of the first lecture in computer science. How do you model daily world? Because the daily world is a model for what's going on in computer science nowadays. So concurrency is important, and my focus is on so-called compositional proof systems. Proof methods, I'll speak about them, explain what they are, and that's then what in my archive is highlighted. Then I've been a bit practical, and I was always interested in the correctness of algorithms. And I selected a couple ones, the so-called Deutscher-Waite marking algorithm in garbage collection, list copying algorithms, which were highlighted in 75, 76, and we had the most efficient ones, really the best ones. Then the minimum weight spanning tree algorithm of Gallagher, Hamle, and Spira, which is highlighted in the book by Nancy Lynch on distributed computing as one of the main and most complicated algorithms. And then we dabbled a lot on a serial bus protocol, the mechanical verification. The subject in which I maybe had the most influence was in state charts. This is something you won't know so much about. It can very well be that in the end this subject is of most importance to you, because it guarantees that if you're flying in an A340 or an A380 and the pilot turns on the automatic pilot, there is no error in that program which constitutes automatic pilot. It has been proven completely correct, 1,000,000 lines. Basically on a formalism which is akin to state charts. So this is of practical importance for you, because of course you want to survive your flight. In a lesser sense, if you own a BMW, the brakes are modeled by state charts and automatic brakes and have been removed. I'll tell a little bit about the relational theory. So this is then my personal development, and there are certain terms which I have to introduce there. I started under Jaco de Bakker and published a paper on the first iCalc on the calculus of relations as used in programming, and introduced their so-called predicate transformers. My thesis was in 55 on recursive program schemes, and there I developed an axiom system for the relational calculus. I was no logician. I was an applied mathematician, according to the title on my certificate. So I didn't know that completeness was very important. It turned out later, 25 years later, that my axiomatization of the relational calculus was at this very moment the most manageable axiomatization which is complete of the calculus of relations. I made a trick, I did a trick there due to the fact that I was naive. And because of my naivete, I only used something simple. I may speak about it later or on other occasions. But enough to mention here that this contains axiom system for the binary relations, which turned out to be complete and of course sounds. Then to my surprise, I'm the first one who published on greatest fixed points. Recently, an Italian colleague of mine in Bologna wrote a paper on the history of bisimulation, and the word greatest fixed points is vital for the concept, for an appropriate definition of, in order to define bisimulation correctly. And this will be one of my salient bits later. Then I used the mu calculus, which is known to John, for example, and from Peter, as an assertion language for fairness arguments, and proved that you could use that in order to define strongest postconditions. David Park having proved that already for weakest preconditions. And I unified concurrency with Job spheres in a kind of pseudo-relational theory. And then what I knew about all this, because it would soon be lost, of course, I put in this book Data Refinement, which was great fun in writing, together with Kai Engelhardt. That's relations. And I documented what I know about relations here, especially all the nasty counterexamples I mentioned there. Concurrency is important, so yeah. It's what, Homo sapiens sapiens as it developed, it has become such a successful species because it deals with concurrency in a non-exponential way. So maybe some of you have heard about model checking, exponential barrier and all that nonsense. It exists, but the fact that we can live with it are we ourselves. Somewhere in our brains, we have the machinery to cope with concurrency. I can look at all of you, I can react with all of you. And if I would have the state space, I would have a map of the state space in your brain of all of you. I would have a map who has more states than the number of electrons in the universe. And obviously I haven't. So I can deal with you without dealing with the exponential explosion, because I only deal with the interfaces. And that's what concurrency, compositional concurrency, compositionality in concurrency is about. I started in CSP semantics, with I'll describe that later. Then was helped by Tony Hoare, a very fruitful collaboration. Together with Abt and Francis, I developed a proof theory, published in Top Plus, and in 80. And that's what the publication I owe my professorates. I've had 3, 2 in the Netherlands and 1 in Germany, in Kiel. Then I developed the compositional theory of semantics, of concurrency, compositional semantics, full abstraction, logics, and proof theory for real-time concurrency in approximately 20 years, but earlier than most, so that my students had time to focus on it. Metric topological comes from my chair, actually. introduction of it. Then there was a vehicle, a technical vehicle, the cooperation test, which made this proof rule tick. And that could be applied to all monitor-based languages. First we discovered them useful in concurrent ADA, bring also distributed processes, monitor-based languages, and then 20 years later it turned out to be necessary to describe Java monitors, Java multithreading and concurrency. The main publication, in a sense, in these years on this topic, apart from my book, was a thesis by Job Swiers, a student of mine, and it was a book which came out in '89, and it was the first book, Springer Lecture Notes, number 321, on compositionality. So this one. This is really scholarly. It's incredible that it is a thesis. It's also readable because I only like readable stuff. So it's the original book on compositionality. And then I had my concurrency verification book, 770 pages, 800 if you count all of them, with 7 co-authors, and in it I unified something like the material of 15 till 20 theses. It was all written anew. So I had to write every chapter myself in order to get a uniform account. And then we worked quite successfully in concurrent Java. That's recent, and it's not anymore part of the archive. Of course, it can be donated to the archive in case. There's a need. I worked on algorithms also because I wanted to know what is difficult in algorithms. As a student, people told me, you know, look at garbage collectors. There was something called Deutscher Weight, it's list processing. How does it work? Well, started giving a correctness proof. And then there were state-of-the-art list copying algorithms, which were already an order of magnitude more complicated. State-of-the-art means those are which are used in Lisp compilers. And how to prove those? Now quickly we found out that the assertions which we used in order to prove those represented pages and pages of A4. So certain assertions had a length of 4 A4s. That's not very practical if you do program verification because you're not sure that what you have written down is correct. So then we hit upon an ID which since then has disappeared again, I don't know, of Susan Gerhardt, correctness preserving program transformations. So we could give the right assertions and then we proved the simulation relation between the various layers of our formalism satisfying correct data refinement, and then we knew we had a good proof on the lowest level where we had, because we knew that correctness was preserved, we had proved also correctness of the eventual algorithm. This was very interesting because it's the focus nowadays of separation logic, and it shows where separation logic has to go in order to show it's not only interesting intellectually, but it also can do something. As far as I know, separation logic has not as yet tackled algorithms of this complexity. It should go. What was successful from my point of view was the minimum weight spanning tree algorithm, distributed minimum weight spanning tree calculation due to Gallagher, Humblett and Spira, and we gave in '87 a correctness proof of that. And then in '88, Lamport and Nancy Lynch and other people, I discussed that, followed. And still nowadays, correctness proofs are generated for that algorithm and constitute a thesis for the students in their various formalisms. Patronets, for example, recently a thesis. And then as the last thing, we went into, dabbled a bit in mechanical verification for serial bus protocols. other people in my chair worked on the correctness of atomic broadcasts, group membership, atomic commitment, sliding window protocols used in Philips, in the apparatus which you buy. If you buy Philips multimedia, then they have in them these sliding window protocols of this particular form, which have been proven correct. And then maybe the fields where I, without knowing it, exerted most influence. Stage art was a modeling, was a graphical language, is a graphical language, which can be executed mechanically, can be executed on a computer. So what you do, you specify something by pictures, and it is exact. It leads to computation and well-defined run of states, and because it's graphical, many people grasp the meaning of it. And this was especially important in Israel. It was born in Israel because there was this problem which the Israelis coped with. They had the Mirage fighters, and some war, the 76 or the 73 or the 69 war, I don't know, with Egypt. They got those, and they wanted to define the successor. And building a fighter is something the Israelis could, but programming it, they couldn't. They didn't know very well how to do it. So de Gaulle bypassed the Secret Service of his country and allowed the 10 wagon loads of specification of the computing system of the Mirage to be shipped to Israel. Until, of course, this happened somewhere from Brittany in a shadowy night, in a rainy port, let's say. It was raining, sleet was there, and the French Secret Service got the wind of it. So they didn't get the complete last container. Now, writing new software on the basis of that is undoable. So the Israelis knew this won't work. And what did Harel do? He devised the formalism on the basis of which the successor of the Mirage fighter got its embedded software, the La Vie fighter. That thing was, of course, highly successful, and since Israel is the 51st state of the United States, as you know, financially, it only exists because of the billions of dollars which are poured every year from the United States into Israel. American industry has a say in how these billions of dollars are spent. And American aircraft industry objected to Israel developing fighters. So there became a flat no from the White House. You're forbidden to develop this fighter. You have to use American material. Okay. But in the meantime, the technological advance, the conceptual advance, state charts was there and was developed. Now, I saw it and I really knew instantly, this is the thing of the future. So I started working with my team in 84, 85. You have all the papers and all the stadia of publication in my archive on this. And I thought this was just ideal for an academic like me and for my group to work on thesis, full abstractness proofs, semantics, design choices in state charts. That's it, I thought. All those papers are in the archive. What was surprising that Harel, having been brought up in MIT, and whose father was a very important academic in Israel, also in England, he was called Harold Fish. In the beginning, Fish.
From Harrogate in Yorkshire.
Yeah, you know that. Yeah, the Fish family. Didn't consider it as academically respectable. So there we had these guys working on this system, which was highly successful, and me luckily publishing on it. Getting the first paper on full abstractness of asemantics, then giving a compositional axiomatization of asemantics, then explained how you could look at the various semantics, the 4 or 5 main semantics of that's strange, 4 or 5 main semantics. The thing runs in state-mate. So there's only one semantics. No, apparently there are 4 or 5. And then I even did compositionality in TCS and official journals here. And then, so these were the first papers which made it respectable, the subject respectable. And then I did something important. By then there were 38 semantics for state charts. And I commissioned something. I was not interested in publishing that paper. Commissioned Michael van der Beek to write a comparison of 37 or 38 state chart variants in 94. The thing started in 84, 10 years later. And finally, the main people behind state charts, which were Penueli and David Huil, started realizing that the fish was stinking from the top. Somewhere they had to acknowledge that there was a semantics for state charts. I published 38 of them. Here, I had that. And in 95, they started finally to publish what the semantics of state chart was about. This was a crucial mistake because the semantics was far too complicated. This was known to the people in France, and they developed a much better semantics for these type of languages, synchronous languages, in the beginning of the 80s. And on the basis of that, on the synchronous languages, you have the crucial papers in my archive there of Berry and the groups. It was possible to develop a specification formalism, to have a specification formalism developed by, commanded by Airbus, the builder of the Airbus 380 and the 320, 319. Airbus 320 is, I believe, the single most successful aircraft in aviation history at the moment. And the specification of the software there led to the fact that they were able to prove a million lines of code, 500,000 or 1,000,000 lines of code correct. Contrary to this philosophy in the States, where they say if you define an aircraft, you write down a tender, I believe it is, and then you look which company has the lowest price, and then you ask it, and then some sorted pieces of software are developed. And then later on you hope to be able to test the mistakes out of it. This is a completely different approach. This is the approach followed by Boeing, whereas in continental Europe we proved that such programs can be proved correct, even if it's 1,000,000 lines of specialized C code. One of the reasons why Airbus is so successful. In the meantime, state charts and the system state-mate became respectable, so I stopped publishing a lot on it. A couple of theses came out and got its own momentum, and at least David Huil got the ACM Software Systems Award for state-mate, the system executing these state charts, this graphical formalism, in 2007. Well, now this is the dry part, which I hope enlivened a little bit for you already. And now what are interesting publications? In the relational theory of programming. Once I explained to Bill Wage how I thought about relations and what the crux of my axiom system was, he realized as a logician that there was a simple natural deduction system behind my way of reasoning about them. And he defined that and he published it. He did not publish it. He published it as a report in 82 or 83 or something like that, I believe, maybe even end of the 70s. He did not publish it. But it was the simplest system in existence. There were lots of people around, Roger Maddox and Marcel Frias and etc., dealing with extremely complicated axiom systems. I always forget what the crucial point was. It was a brilliant maximal reduction from n projection functions of n-1 projection functions and n-2 projection functions until you have 2 projection functions. So what do? You put in the natural numbers there, and you need the natural numbers and the full power to define that, and the result, the system can never be complete, finished. Once you have the natural numbers in some way in, you can't have an axiom system. Because of I naive and I was no logician, I didn't do that. I introduced for every n projection functions of a state to its components. That was all, And that turned out to be the crux to getting a complete axiom system. Later on, my axiom system was proved proved complete by Friax and Maddox. That's not in my archive because it's beyond 90. But this jewel, the best axiomatization, hasn't been published. Now, by now, people know that it exists, and I've sent copies because I'm the only one who's sending out copies. Not anymore now, because I don't have my copy anymore. My copy is now in the University of Swansea. So John can now send out, and I'll pass people on to John now to make copies of this precious publication. I think this is the rarest publication of the whole archive, and maybe worth the whole archive.
Does Bill Wage have a copy?
He has a copy, but he didn't want to spread it. Why? Because he was now working on a language called Lucid with Bill at Ashcroft. And once he realized how extremely elegant binary relations were, he realized they would be a competitor to Lucid. And he, by all means, he wanted to eliminate competitors. So he published it, but he didn't, let's say, he wrote it down as a report, but he then published it in large because he didn't want to have competitors for Lucid. This is clearly a non-scientific approach. I think this is a nice story. It's completely true. I haven't exaggerated. I don't even when it came out. You have the copy, John. So.
Look it up later on.
My hero in relational theory of programming is David Park, I have to say. He died in 1990, far too early, of course. If you look in the official obituary, you see even the way he was neglected, because they say he was born in 1945, whereas he has born in 1935. I knew that because I was born in 43 and he was older than I was. So I looked it up the day before yesterday and I said, hey, Mike, whatever, Patterson made a mistake in the obituary. Why? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe somebody is a hero. It is because he was, in a sense, the least of a modern day scientist. Apart from the crucial points, which I now mention, he had a personal attitude. He said, if you want to publish, it should be new. That means the 99.9% of all so-called research publications, most of which are now epsilon extensions to existing results, and which are just in an extended sense development rather than research, he didn't want to consider. He only wanted to consider essential concepts. So he said, I discovered least fixed points. He did that in programming because he was working on Lisp and helped to define Lisp with John McCarthy. And at that moment, he already said there's a least fixed point there. So in the end, it were, of course, a couple of people, Scott and de Bakker, Antoni Mazakiewicz, whose paper was obscured and, let's say, on purpose got lost until it showed up again 2-3 years later in information control. He was also one who submitted that paper in 68 or 69. But of course, somebody was jealous. Huh? And then, who else do you have? Least fixed points. I think Peter will know. Who else discovered them? Park. Bekic, of course, development discovered them. There were 4. Mazakiewicz. Oh yeah, then I have them. Yeah. Okay. Huh?
4
No. Form didn't.
Yes, the paper from the 70s.
Yeah, it was 60s. It was discovered in the 60s. These papers were in handwriting, written in handwriting, most of them, and those handwritten versions are in my archive. So the extreme case of somebody publishing only when he has something to say was, by the way, Robert Floyd, who published every 5 years a paper when he had something new to say. You know, he was one of the most influential persons in algorithmic complexity and devised many of the most efficient algorithms in his field at his time. Now, what's the heritage of David Park? I think the best thesis on the relational programming verification ever produced is completely unknown. It's the one by Peter Hitchcock. Park didn't publicize his results. My thesis would have been the best if I would have been able to give a completeness proof for my relational calculus. But since I didn't, it was far from the best. Peter Hitchcock's thesis, if you come to read about it, and his characterization of termination is something which still amazes people. The main result is described in an accessible version for formally trained people in chapter 2 of my data refinement book. The best paper on the relational theory of program verification is the one by Hitchcock and Park in the first ICALP, Induction Rules and Termination Proofs. He really made clear what induction and recursion was and how it dealt with termination and then what it means to prove invariant properties in a recursive program. And then this is entirely my own responsibility. The best note on the relational theory of program verification is also in my archive, but I don't know exactly its title. It's written by David Park in his unimitable handwriting, and he produces a counterexample showing that Robin Milner's original theory of bisimulation is wrong. The main concept on which Milner's theory rests. You need it there in order to define bisimulation, a notion of an infinity and potential infinity of computations which you had to capture, and that needs for its linguistic capture greatest fixed points. This is typically what you read. So if you read the basic book by Robin Milner, the first thing you read is in the beginning bisimulation theory by Park and Milner, and afterwards Park is never mentioned anymore. But it is fun to see that this crucial counterexample, which is incredibly difficult and over which Robin once told to me, he couldn't believe that a person like David Park could conjure it up. For posterity, that's my own interpretation, what I think that has been said. So I'm not saying that Robin Milner said that. Willem says that Robin Milner says it. I found it's typical of the way David Park was treated, the legacy of David Park was treated in Great Britain. Underestimated. Needless to say that all these ideas which are there have been rediscovered many times since then. Sometimes I was a referee and I could point out that they had been rediscovered if they were lucky enough. Sometimes I wasn't a referee of them, and then they were published. And the funny thing I noticed that if somebody rediscovers a central concept, it somehow is the case that it is. I never got a better expose in the rediscovery when compared with the original discovery. This is funny. You know, Quicksort was rediscovered in the Prolog environment, and then they tried to publish it as a new algorithm. So it's not new. Upper and lower derivatives are regularly rediscovered. So this is what I have to say about that. Then the mathematical theory of concurrency. I see I'm far too slow, this I have to catch up. It's still a very important topic nowadays, and there are still the basic camps. What is a concurrent process? championed by Milner and his school, an enormously impressive school. And then what does a concurrent process? How do you notice that concurrency is at play? And this is championed by Tony Hoare and his followers. And academically speaking, certainly a less impressive school than Ron Milner's school. What I have to say about those is that it's interesting that it remained a dichotomy. As Peter can say, just during the 75th celebration of Tony's birthday last week in Microsoft Cambridge, the authors of the various positions tried to approximate but didn't get into agreement. Okay, there is a basic paper nobody talked about a basic pioneer who died, Hans Bekic. He posed that question probably as one of the first ones in a little-known paper, report, again not published, towards a mathematical theory of processes, a publication of IBM Labs, Vienna. I have it in my archive. Since time is running out, I drop the rest of this. Of course, salient factors of vital concepts in being independently rediscovered by famous authors 3 years after he had published in the normal media. I quote what I've written here, independently rediscovered by. These stories happen. Now something more personal. When I was working on the proof theory of CSP, I noticed that Nissim Francis and I were not sufficiently logically capable, and as a result had to get a logician there. So I approached a logician called Christoph Abt, still very prolific, and I taught him concurrency in 9 months, everything I knew, and made sure that he made all the mistakes which he had to make in order to understand how the corrections were. And the three of us published a paper. I was hellishly convinced that we had no time, so in 1979 we submitted it and we got it in top plus. Little did we know that there was somebody who was 3 weeks behind us who also was submitting a paper. And there you see the ridiculous situation that one submits a paper to a journal, somebody else has, let's say, 1 day later. What's the difference between 1 day and 3 weeks? A report also wants to submit it, and all at once the effect of the other guy gets lost. I find that unjust, and I since then always mentioned Levin and Greece as independent authors of the ideas involved in these Hoare logics for communicating sequential processes. However, somebody else had a nice vindication on me. There was a kind of conceptual revenge, because I came out of my plane in the Netherlands and proud I had made my day. This thing was really made me turn high during months that I succeeded it. I looked upon my desk and I got a preliminary copy of a not so known paper, Proofs of Networks of Processes by Missa and Chandy. I looked at it, I saw it, and my being high was over, because the paper was definitely better than mine. I immediately recognized my superiors there. It was much better. It developed, of course, incomplete, because Missa and Chandy, you can't expect that they can immediately get complete axiomatizations across without Abt being there as a co-author. Incomplete axiomatization of CSP, but it was compositional. And then, after that experience, I realized that compositionality had a future. Now, I don't have so much time left, but I suppose I can also go over time a little bit. But I still want to explain to you what compositionality is about. So, I don't know if you know it. The difference was my paper and that of Mr. and Chandy was the so-called compositional logic. Now what's the compositional semantics? The semantics of a composed construct is a certain function of the semantics of its constituents. So the semantics of the meaning of somehow of the composition is given in terms of the meaning of the parts and the ways these parts are put together. Our logic is for sequential programming compositional. If you give a Hoare proofs this rule for sequential composition, you first prove something for, say, for S1 semicolon S2, you prove first something about S1, you prove something on S2, and when you have these separate proofs, if the assertions satisfy this scheme, that the Q here, the post-condition for S1 is the precondition S2, you can conclude something about the composition. Now what did people want to have? This didn't work for concurrency, as observed by many people. They wanted to have this rule. Exactly the same rule, but now something about concurrency. So if you've proved P1 S1 Q1 and P2 S2 Q2 for certain P assertion kinds of assertions, then you want to prove that P1 and P2 implies that after termination of S1 parallel S2 Q1 and Q2 holds. Now, as you know, concurrency leads to exponential explosion in the concurrence product, in the semantics of the concurrent composition. But what do we have here? We prove something about the parts and we conclude something about the composition. There's no explosion there. It's not there, simply. Sorry, I see. It's not there. So if you're capable of finding such a proof rules, you've beaten the compositional explosion, the exponential explosion. Mr. and Chandy were the first to formulate a proof system in which this was the case. This rule was sound. Of course, very special conditions on the Pi's, the Qi's for this to hold. It's called also the verified well-developed paradigm, especially used in compositional theorem proving and compositional model checking, because modern model checkers rely on beating the exponential complexity of parallel composition. So this is the reason compositionality is important for concurrency. Everything I knew about concurrency is in the book there. Compositionality in concurrency and compositionality in programming language is important. It goes back to Gottlob Frege, see the nutshell caption in my concurrency verification book, who said compositionality is the key to understanding how people understand sentences. Somebody can speak a sentence to you which you've never heard before in your whole life, and still you understand its meaning. And that can only be the case if the constituents of those sentences, the parts of these sentences, and the way these are put together can be recognized by you. So what these parts mean is something which you recognize, and this new composition of these parts is something which you understand, and as a result, new sentences which you've never heard before can be understood by a human being. It has to do with the process of generating sentences and how understanding is generated. This compositionality discovered by an ivory tower German logician in 1923. He looks typically as you think he would be. A professor, everything fast, pipe, stern. Yeah, okay. This was all discovered by Janssen and Van Em de Boas. I'm glad to have heard that these people are already in contact with you, with John. And they explained in papers which are all in my archive the impact of Frege's principle of compositionality for the semantics of programming and natural languages using Montague grammars. This is the way in which Montague grammars are rather sophisticated grammar, as a result of which you can define the meaning of natural language, certain forms of natural languages. And they play a part when you give the proper treatment of dereferencing and referencing and assignment, and also in the combination of concurrency. So now I have to come to a close. I want to speak shortly about other people. Now, compositionality and concurrency is important, so I wrote an 800-page book, which 770 are printed actually. Abstraction and refinement was fun for me, and it was just a game which I played with my students in the 90s. Data refinement. How did I get at it? Well, you know all those books. The Science of Programming by a famous computer scientist. The Discipline of Programming by an even more famous computer scientist. The Art of Programming by the absolute apostle of modern-day computer science. The Craft of Programming by the guy who helped to discover separation logic. Systematic software development by a guy who is so heavy that if you see him, you know sorry, I shouldn't tell this. A rigorous approach to software development, absolutely fail-safe. A practical theory of programming by somebody who appears to be modest, but in his modesty is even overdoing it. Predicative programming, fantastic. Yeah. My students went through all these books. I discussed them in my courses. Scientific, discipline, art, craft, systematic, rigor, practical, predicative. These are beautiful terms. These express exactly the author's intent. And only very rarely, if you get those books, they cover the contents of the books. How did I find that out? Well, I gave the same set of exercises, something like 50 exercises to my students. And he said, here's the book, I lecture on it, these are the main ingredients, and give the correctness proofs using the methodologies described in those brilliant books by brilliant scientists. And well, first I chose 2 books or 3 books, and at a certain moment students started objecting. It's so boring. We prove all the time the same. The proof is the same, Professor. Willem, in my case. What? These widely different books with widely different claims, are they all amounting to the same? Yeah, apparently. It's always the same proof we're given. Whether it's Greece, or whether it's Dijkstra, or whether it's Tony, or whether it's Reynolds, or whether it's Knut, or whether it is Hayner, or whether it's Nancy Lynch, or you name it. It's always the same. So my students, we put our heads together. My best collaborator at the moment, Job Sweers in that area, I said, well, there must be something going on. And what did we find out? That the so-called rules for data refinement, by some called data reification, with notes to how the reification is defined in the Oxford Encyclopedia, the Oxford Dictionary, or abstraction in another book. They were all the same. Did the same. Completely different phrasing, completely similar content. And so we wrote a book in which at least different formalisms are explained, and on data refinement, and we proved that mathematically all these formalisms were the same. So basically, one theorem with a proof of 200 pages is contained in the not so fat book on your desk. My students helped me on that theorem. Well, I worked on compositionality and concurrency, and then compositionality and concurrency and data refinement. My student Rob Gertz put the two together in the notion compositional data refinement. All refinement nowadays is compositional, but he was the first to find it. He published it in 1990. Interface refinement, meaning the refinement of atomic actions, is still a topic not systematically investigated nowadays. Published by these people, the first publication in 88 and 90. Then formal verification of self-modifying code. Nobody ever thought even about it, that it can exist such a thing. Published by Rob Gertz in 1990. All reports which are not known, obscure, nobody knows of their existence, nuggets in my archive. You see that there is here a difference between people tackling new problems and publishing epsilon papers. Not so Rob Gertz and David Park. I think it's time for me to finish. There is a sobering note. Who are the victims? There's a paper by Henk Goeman. G-O-A, you will say Goeman. Goeman, as you pronounce it. He discovered that you could program mutual exclusion without making use of hardware primitives. This was not known in the mid-60s. He wrote his proof. He submitted it to Tony Hoare, other Panpun. They rejected the paper, which is completely correct. Because it was contrary to the philosophy of that time. Then he submitted it, he sent it in despair to Leslie Lamport. Yeah, there was just an unhappy coincidence. Leslie Lamport was just at that moment conceiving his so-called bakery algorithm, which does exactly the same. So here you see the paper of a victim of the history of computing. The pundits working on hearsay and not reading the paper well, and the guy who could have saved him, well, working just on the same topic. I'm sure I asked Leslie, and I know him well enough to know when he is lying and not. He was indeed working independently on it. So, but he didn't send the paper to, I believe, distributed computing or the CACM for being published. He didn't do that, at least. Okay. And then it's up to you, and I discussed this widely yesterday. One of the persons who in my archive who's mentioned best and has most publications there is called Leslie Lamport. And now a question for you. Why doesn't Leslie Lamport get the Turing Award? He's certainly a far more important computer scientist. He's the father of distributed computing. That is known and accepted. He's certainly far more influential than, for example, this year's recipient of the Turing Award, or last year's, I have to say, Barbara Liskov, and her 10 predecessors. You can just say this. Leslie is a towering figure, and as you know what he has done, you see he's more impressive.
Thank you very much for your lecture and also for taking the trouble to examine your archive. I think the obvious thing to do is to invite a few questions before people have to go on about their ordinary duties. And so perhaps I can invite someone to start the questions.
So a hot topic nowadays is multi-core architectures, and it seems that we don't have a suitable language for programming and developing implementations for such architectures. Are there any threads in your work that lead in that direction that would give a handle on that kind of problem?
No, I cannot tell so, but there is another remark which I want to make on this. Next week I have to lecture in Bergen on why you have to teach concurrency at a university. And I was checking it's of course obvious you have to, otherwise your department is worthless. If you don't do that, you don't prepare students for the next 30, 40 years of industrial development if you don't deal with concurrency. But the answer was, yeah, Willem, concurrency has never been fundamentally tackled. There is at this moment no proper programming or modeling language for concurrency in which people agree on and which is taught, let's say, in the first course in the first year, because every computation nowadays deals with concurrency. Sequential is really the past. As we are sitting here, we have so many concurrent agents. This you should be able to model. Concurrent situations are the rule. Sequential situations are the exception. There are no languages. Java, for example, certainly, and C# and C++ and Spec# are of such an astonishing complexity, and I can prove that mathematically. It's a mathematical proof that you know that those can never be the solution. So the programming languages used nowadays for concurrency, which I mentioned, these 4 or 5, cannot be a solution to describing concurrency decently. So I am not amazed that this problem is there with multi-core architectures. Of course, there is a way of dealing with it, because otherwise these people can't program with it. But I'm not amazed at all that there's no satisfactory language. And that's what you're asking. You're asking is the satisfactory. So I can only say concurrency is a very important topic. It's a hot topic. It's a complicated topic. But patronets are not a solution because they don't size up. Patronet is only useful if you can write it down. No. More than 2 efforts you don't want. Well, most programs need a patronet which is as large as this floor. Unreadable. Algebras don't size up. Languages are there, concurrency languages are there. What I use myself is toy languages by Andrews, Greg Andrews, in his book Concurrent, Distributed and Multi-Threaded Programming, an old book. And I find that these elements of abstraction, his level of abstraction as concepts, is simple and explains to students what concurrent algorithms are. And I think you more have to think in this direction. Simple languages for very high level of abstraction which hide all the detail of Java, because Java requires too much detail, and still allow you to concentrate on the essential flow of control.
Other questions?
You were talking a bit about the use of state charts
Yeah.
at Airbus. So were they using the very complicated Harold's method?
No, they use STRL, a combination of STRL and Lustre. That's not right. It's not right. They use actually a combination in the tool SCADE. They use a combination of Lustre for the nodes and state charts for the spatial distribution of the nodes. You should realize all these tools are in the end built and commissioned by Airbus. So certain versions are accessible and other versions used in Airbus are somehow not so easily accessible, although they will be published later, because this is of course the main commercial advantage which Airbus has over Boeing. In Boeing there states there is not this tradition. This will soon change because FAA is turning to the French method, the French way of specifying real-time embedded system. For example, for landing gear, they did that 2 years ago. I don't know what happened since then. But the FAA, for it to put a seal of approval on a new concept of that importance stipulates that it has to be specified in the S12 formalism, or a formalism akin to S12.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to thank you very much for your lecture.
Excellent.
And, invite everyone to thank you in the standard way. And thank you all for coming. Maybe Mark.